Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to explore an intriguing topic, Forest Society and Colonialism. This is the first slide, and it sets the stage for what's to come. We'll look at how forests have been shaped by social forces and colonial histories. Over the next few slides, we'll delve into the relationships between communities, forests, and colonial powers, and examine the impacts and ongoing consequences. I'm excited to have you all here, so let's get started. Let's take a look at the contents of our presentation. We start with the introduction, setting the stage for our discussion. Then, we move into various topics, including the reasons behind deforestation, which we'll explore under Why Deforestation. Land to be improved. This helps us understand the motivations for clearing forests, often driven by the need for more land for agriculture, settlement, or resources. Next, we examine how forest rules and policies affected cultivation practices, shaping how people interacted with the forest landscape. We'll also delve into plantation methods and how scientific forestry emerged as a systematic approach to managing forest resources sustainably. As we progress, we'll see how new trades, employment opportunities, and services developed, transforming local economies and societies. The geographical structure of Bastar will give us a spatial understanding of the region, highlighting its unique features. We'll discuss shifting cultivation practices and how they were practiced traditionally, along with the colonial response to these practices, often restrictive and disruptive. The rebellion in the forest, led by tribal communities like Salmon, reveals the resistance against colonial policies. We'll analyze how the British responded and the broader impacts on the local people. The presentation also covers how the people of Bastar were affected, socially, economically, and environmentally, and the dependence of local communities on forest resources. We'll look at the fear among the people and how forest transformation occurred in other regions like Java, providing comparative insights. Finally, we'll explore recent developments in forest management, the ongoing challenges with deforestation caused by war and other factors, and the ways in which colonial and Dutch scientific forestry practices changed the landscape. Throughout, our goal is to understand the complex relationship between people, forests, and colonial policies, connecting these points to the larger theme of environmental and social change. Welcome to this chapter. Today, we'll start by exploring what is meant by forest society, which primarily refers to communities living in forests, often tribal groups with deep connections to their natural environment. We'll also look at colonialism, which is when one country takes control over another, politically, economically, and socially. For example, the British colonized India, which had profound impacts on our society and environment. So, what will we focus on in this chapter? First, we'll discuss deforestation, what causes it, and the various issues that arise from it, such as loss of biodiversity and climate change. Then, we'll examine commercial forestry, understanding what it entails, how it impacts ecosystems, and the processes involved. Finally, we'll look at specific stories, like those of Bastar in India and Java in Indonesia, to see how colonialism affected these regions, both their forests and societies. By understanding these key points, we can better grasp the connections between colonial history, forest ecosystems, and current environmental challenges. Now, let's talk about why deforestation is a significant issue and how it relates to land that needs to be improved. First, what exactly is deforestation? It's the process where forests disappear, which can happen naturally, but more often it's due to human activities. Reckless cutting down of trees on a large scale is what we call deforestation. And while this isn't a new phenomenon, it definitely became more systematic and widespread during the colonial era. Understanding this helps us see how human actions have historically impacted our forests, and why addressing deforestation is crucial for land improvement efforts. Let's take a closer look at some of the main reasons behind deforestation. First, we have the need for land to be improved. This includes converting forests into agricultural land to produce food grains for our growing population, as well as using forest land for industrial raw materials. Often, forests are viewed as unproductive, which leads to their clearing for economic development. Next, we see the example of sleepers on the tracks, which points to the expansion of railways and infrastructure development. Historically, the British Navy also played a role here, as naval needs and expansion contributed to forest clearing for shipbuilding and related purposes. Finally, plantation farming by European planters significantly contributed to deforestation. These planters established large plantations for crops like tea, coffee, and rubber, which often involved clearing vast areas of forest. Overall, these reasons reflect how economic and industrial pursuits have historically driven the loss of forest cover, impacting our environment in profound ways. Let's look at how land in India has been improved over time. Back in 1600, only about 1/6 of India's land was under cultivation. Today, that figure has increased to roughly half of the land. This growth happened due to several reasons, mainly the rising population and the increased demand for food, which motivated peasants to extend the boundaries of cultivation. During the British period, we see a significant expansion in the production of commercial crops like jute, sugar, wheat, and cotton. The question is, why did this happen? Well, primarily because these crops served as industrial raw materials, supporting Britain's industries back home. Between 1880 and 1920, the area under cultivation increased by about 6.7 million hectares. The British aimed to generate extra revenue, so expanding cultivation was seen as a sign of progress. However, this often meant clearing forests, which brought along many problems, environmental and social. Additionally, the growing urban population created a higher demand for food, pushing for more land to be cultivated. Unfortunately, the colonial government viewed forests as unproductive wilderness, so they often disregarded their ecological importance. Instead, they prioritized land that could generate revenue and meet food needs, even if it meant environmental costs. So overall, the expansion of cultivated land reflects both economic ambitions and the pressure of a growing population, but it also highlights the environmental impact of these policies. So let's talk about sleepers. What exactly are sleepers? They are the wooden planks laid across railway tracks, and their main role is to hold the tracks in the correct position. They might seem simple, but they are crucial for the stability of the entire railway system. Now, after the 1850s, the expansion of railways became really important, especially for colonial trade and moving troops quickly across territories. Wood was in high demand during this period, not just for building the tracks, but also as fuel for engines. In fact, wood was used extensively to lay railway lines themselves. To give you a sense of scale, each mile of railway track required between 1,760 to 2,000 sleepers. That's a huge amount of wood just to build and maintain the network. And as the railway network expanded rapidly, from about 25,500 kilometers in 1890 to 765,000 kilometers by 1946, the demand for wood skyrocketed. This rapid expansion had a significant environmental impact, especially on forests. For example, in the Madras Presidency alone, around 25,000 trees were cut down annually to meet the wood demand. This led to considerable deforestation, affecting ecosystems and local communities. Lastly, contractors played a significant role in accelerating this problem. Their constant demand for materials pushed the exploitation of forests even further, making it a major environmental concern linked to the railway boom. So, in summary, sleepers were vital for railway development, but their demand contributed heavily to deforestation, illustrating the environmental costs tied to the expansion of colonial infrastructure. Now, moving on to another important aspect of British influence in India, let's talk about the problem of deforestation caused by the British Royal Navy. As many of you know, by the early 19th century, oak forests in England were rapidly disappearing. This created a serious issue because oak was a key material for building ships. Without enough timber locally, the Royal Navy needed to find alternative sources. So, search parties were sent to India to explore and identify suitable timber resources. This led to the export of vast quantities of Indian timber, especially valuable hardwoods, to England. While this helped meet the Royal Navy's needs, it also resulted in significant deforestation in India. This example highlights how colonial demands for resources often had environmental consequences, connecting to the broader theme of how colonial powers exploited Indian resources for their own benefit, sometimes at great ecological cost. Another important reason for deforestation is plantation farming. You see, as the demand for products like palm oil, rubber, and other commercial crops has grown, large areas of forests are being cleared to make way for these plantations. This process often involves cutting down vast stretches of trees, which not only destroys habitats, but also reduces biodiversity. It's a significant factor because it reflects how economic development and the push for agricultural commodities can sometimes come at the expense of our natural ecosystems. So, understanding this helps us see how human activities, especially agriculture, are deeply intertwined with the ongoing challenge of deforestation. So, what exactly is plantation farming? Well, it's a type of commercial farming where large areas of land are used to grow crops primarily for profit. Often, these are big plantations where crops like tea, coffee, and rubber are cultivated. To make space for these crops, large natural forests were cleared. Now, why was this done? Mainly to meet Europe's increasing demands for industrial raw materials and trade. European planters played a big role here. They cleared vast stretches of land to set up these plantations. Interestingly, the East India Company encouraged this process by inviting European entrepreneurs to invest in plantation farming. They also sold the land at lower rates to make it easier for planters to establish large-scale operations. This development was a key part of the broader economic and colonial expansion, linking local land use with global trade demands. It's a clear example of how economic needs drove significant environmental and social changes during that period. So let's talk about the rise of commercial forestry. First, what exactly is commercial forestry? Essentially, it's the practice of planting and managing forests primarily for economic benefits, such as timber and other forest products. The main idea here is to produce resources that can generate income, rather than just conserving forests for ecological reasons. Now, why was commercial forestry introduced in India? The key reason was the need for monetary gain. During British rule, they needed timber for their expanding naval fleet and the rapid development of railways. Timber was a critical resource for building ships and railway ties, among other things. However, there was a concern about local populations using the forests freely, which might lead to overexploitation or destruction. To address this, the British government invited a German expert named Dietrich Brandes to help manage the forests effectively. He was appointed as the first Inspector General of Forests in India. His role was crucial because he brought scientific forestry methods and helped establish a system of sustainable forest management, balancing economic needs with conservation. This marked the beginning of organized commercial forestry in India, aligning with the broader theme of how colonial powers managed natural resources for their benefit, while also laying the foundation for future forest policies. Continuing from before, I want to highlight Dietrich Brandes and his significant contributions to forestry. He was a strong believer in the science of conservation, and he thought that this science should be supported by legal measures. Essentially, he understood that sustainable forest management required not just knowledge, but also rules backed by law. He promoted the idea that timber production through conservation was essential, meaning that activities like felling trees and grazing by tribal communities needed to be regulated. To put this into practice, he established the Indian Forest Service back in 1864, which was a major step toward professionalizing forestry in India. Following that, he helped formulate the Indian Forest Act of 1865, which was later amended twice, in 1878 and again in 1927, to adapt to changing needs and ensure better forest management. Another key achievement was founding the Imperial Forest Research Institute at Dehradun in 1906. This institute became a hub for scientific forestry, focusing on research and education to improve forest conservation techniques. Now, on the legal front, Brandeis emphasized the importance of rules governing the use of forest resources. These rules aim to regulate activities like timber harvesting and grazing, ensuring they could be carried out sustainably. And of course, there had to be punishments in place for those who violated these rules, reinforcing the legal framework needed to protect our forests effectively. Overall, his work laid the foundation for systematic forest management in India, combining scientific principles with legal support to promote conservation. Let's continue to explore how forest laws evolved, specifically with the amendment to the Forest Act of 1865 in 1878. This amendment introduced a classification system for forests, dividing them into three main categories. First, we have reserved forests. In these areas, villagers were not allowed to take anything from the forest, not even for their own use. It was a strict protection measure. Next, there are protected forests. Here, villagers could collect resources like wood, but only under specific permissions and for particular purposes, such as fuel or building materials. Finally, we have village forests, which were designated to involve local communities in sustainable management. Understanding these categories helps us see how the law aimed to balance conservation with the needs of local populations, shaping forest management practices that continue to influence policies today. Today, we're looking at the concept of scientific forestry, which played a significant role in India's forest management. This approach was based on the ideas of Dietrich Brandeis, a prominent figure in forestry. He emphasized the importance of systematic and scientific methods to manage forests sustainably. By introducing scientific forestry in India, the focus shifted from arbitrary or traditional methods to more planned and research-based practices. This meant carefully studying forest types, growth patterns, and sustainable yield to ensure that forests could meet both economic and ecological needs. It was a turning point because it laid the foundation for modern forest management in the country, aligning conservation with utilization. So, in the bigger picture, scientific forestry helped us understand how to balance resource use with preservation, which remains relevant even today. So what exactly is scientific forestry? Well, in the past, natural forests, which are diverse and full of different types of trees, were often cut down for timber and other resources. But now, instead of letting these forests grow wild, a different approach has been adopted. Scientists and forest officials started planting just one type of tree in straight, organized rows. This is what we call a plantation. Common examples include teak and sal trees. The idea is to make forest management more efficient and sustainable. Forest officials then surveyed the entire forest area to understand its condition. They made detailed working plans for how to manage these forests effectively. This included deciding how much of the plantation area could be cut each year without harming the overall forest health. Importantly, after cutting some trees, they replant new ones in the same area. This ensures that the forest can be harvested again after some time, creating a cycle of sustainable use. So, in essence, scientific forestry is about planning, managing, and replanting forests systematically to balance economic needs with environmental conservation. So, let's explore how the lives of people were affected by these different perspectives on what a good forest should look like. For villagers, the forest was essentially a resource that needed to meet their daily needs. They valued a diverse mix of species because it provided food, fodder for animals, leaves for various uses, and fuel for cooking and heating. Their idea of a good forest was one that supported their livelihoods and sustenance. On the other hand, the forest department had a different vision. Their focus was more on the economic and industrial potential of the forest. They wanted trees that were suitable for shipbuilding and railway construction, which meant they needed specific types of trees: hardwood, tall, and straight ones like teak and sal. These trees were vital for the industries they supported, and their management priorities reflected that. This difference in perspectives really highlights how people's needs and the broader goals of development can shape how forests are perceived and managed. It's a reminder that sustainable forest management must consider these diverse needs, balancing local livelihoods with industrial requirements, all within the larger theme of harmonizing human and ecological interests. Let's talk about how people depend on forest areas in their daily lives. Forest products are incredibly important. They provide food like fruits and tubers, herbs for medicine, and wood for agricultural tools such as yokes and plows. Bamboo is also widely used for fences, baskets, and various household items. Additionally, people rely on forests for water bottles, disposable plates, cups, ropes, oil, and more. However, the Forest Act introduced some serious challenges. It made activities like cutting wood, grazing cattle, collecting fruits and roots, hunting, and fishing illegal. This created a lot of hardship for villagers who depended on these resources for their livelihood. As a result, many people resorted to stealing wood and other forest products. If caught, they faced significant problems, bribing forest guards, harassment, and other penalties. This situation highlights the delicate balance between conservation efforts and the needs of local communities, which is a key theme in understanding forest management and rural livelihoods. So, let's talk about how forest rule actually impacted cultivation practices. One of the most significant effects of European colonization was on shifting cultivation, which was a common method used by many indigenous communities. Under forest rule, there were new regulations and restrictions imposed that often limited or altered these traditional practices. This meant that communities had less freedom to clear forests and cultivate land in the way they used to. As a result, their agricultural methods had to adapt, which sometimes led to less sustainable practices or forced shifts to different types of cultivation. Overall, these changes not only affected the environment, but also had a profound impact on the social and economic life of the local populations, tying back into the larger theme of how colonial policies reshaped traditional ways of living and working with the land. So, what exactly is shifting cultivation? Well, it's a traditional farming method that many communities in Asia, Africa, and South America have been practicing for generations, mainly by tribal groups. Sometimes it's called swidden agriculture, which refers to the process of clearing land by slash-and-burn techniques and then cultivating it temporarily. This method goes by different names depending on where you are in the world. For example, in Southeast Asia, it's called lading. In Africa, you'll hear it called chitmeen or tavi. In India, there are numerous local names like Dihaya, Penda, Padu, Nevid, Jehum, Bawar, Kundid, and Kumari. Moving to Central America, there's the milpa, which is a traditional crop system involving maize, beans, and squash. In Sri Lanka, they refer to it as China. These names might differ, but the core idea remains the same. It's a way of farming that involves clearing land, cultivating it for a few years, and then letting it lie fallow to restore its fertility. This method is quite significant in understanding how indigenous and rural communities adapt to their environments, often relying on sustainable, traditional practices that have been passed down through generations. It highlights the diversity of farming techniques around the world and how they connect to cultural identities and ecological balance. So, how is shifting cultivation actually practiced? Well, first, a part of the forest is cut down and then burned. This process clears the land and also enriches the soil with nutrients from the ash. After the first monsoon rains, seeds are sown directly into these ashes, which helps the crops to get a good start. Typically, the crops are harvested by October or November. This entire cycle, cutting, burning, sowing, and harvesting, is repeated on the same plot for a few years. However, after a certain period, usually around 12 to 18 years, the plot is left fallow. During this time, the land recovers naturally, and the soil regains its fertility. Meanwhile, a new plot is cleared for farming, and the cycle begins again. An interesting point is that farmers grow a mixture of crops on these plots, things like millets, maize, manioc, beans, and others. This diversity helps maintain soil health and reduces the risk of crop failure. This practice of shifting cultivation is a traditional method that has adapted well to the local environment, and it plays a vital role in the overall landscape and ecological balance we're exploring in this presentation. During the colonial period, European foresters viewed shifting cultivation as harmful to the forest ecosystem. They believed that land used for this purpose, which was cultivated only every few years, couldn't effectively support the growth of valuable trees needed for railway timber. Because of these concerns, the government decided to ban shifting cultivation altogether. This led to the forcible displacement of many communities from their traditional forest homes, forcing them to change their occupations. Some communities resisted these changes through small or large rebellions, but ultimately, they were suppressed. Additionally, burning the forest during shifting cultivation increased the risk of uncontrolled flames spreading, which could destroy valuable timber resources. Another challenge was the difficulty in calculating and collecting taxes from these communities, given the nature of their land use. All these measures reflected the colonial authorities' efforts to control forests, but they also caused social upheaval and disrupted traditional ways of life. So, who could hunt during this time? Well, the new forest laws had a significant impact on the lives of forest dwellers. These people traditionally survived by hunting deer, partridges, and various small animals. But with the introduction of these laws, their customary hunting practices were prohibited. If they were caught hunting, they faced punishment for poaching, which is illegal hunting. At the same time, there's an important contrast to note. While tribes were losing their traditional rights to hunt, hunting of big game like tigers and other large animals became more of a sport. Historically, in ancient India, hunting these animals was part of the culture. But during the colonial period, this practice escalated dramatically. Many species of wildlife, including tigers and wolves, became nearly extinct. You might wonder, why did they kill so many animals? The British considered large animals as symbols of a primitive and savage society. They believed that by killing these animals, they could help civilize India. In fact, people were rewarded for hunting big cats and wolves. So, what started as a cultural practice transformed into a destructive activity, largely driven by colonial attitudes and policies. This shift is a key part of understanding how colonial rule impacted India's natural heritage and traditional ways of life. You might find some of these facts quite surprising. Between 1875 and 1925, over 80,000 tigers and 150,000 leopards were killed primarily for rewards. Killing a tiger was often considered a sporting trophy, a symbol of bravery and status at the time. For example, the Maharaja of Surguja alone shot 1,157 tigers and 2,000 leopards up until 1957. That's a staggering number. Even British administrator George Ewell was responsible for killing 400 tigers. But what's important to note is that, later on, environmentalists and conservationists recognized the devastating impact of these killings. They began advocating fiercely for the protection of these species, marking a significant shift in how we value and preserve wildlife today. This historical context really highlights the importance of conservation efforts that continue to this day. Now, let's look at how new trades, employment opportunities, and services emerged during this period. Colonial control over forests actually had some positive effects, especially in opening up new avenues for trade. Many communities, which traditionally relied on specific occupations, began shifting their focus toward trading forest products like honey and rubber. This shift wasn't limited to just one region. It was a global phenomenon. For example, the Munjaraku people in the Brazilian Amazon transitioned from cultivating manioc to harvesting latex from wild rubber trees. Over time, they became key suppliers of latex to traders, integrating into a broader economic network. This shift highlights how colonial influence could create new economic opportunities, connecting local communities to global markets. It's an important part of understanding the broader changes in employment and trade during this period, showing how traditional ways of life evolved in response to new economic possibilities. Let's talk about the history of trade in India, especially regarding forest products. As you can see, this wasn't a new phenomenon. Even in the medieval period, local communities, such as the Adivasis, were actively engaged in trading a variety of forest resources. They traded items like hides, silk, gums, horns, cocoons, ivory, bamboo, spices, fibers, grasses, and resins. These products were vital not only for their local communities, but also for broader trade networks. The Banjaras, for example, played a significant role as traditional traders, facilitating the movement of these goods across regions. This long-standing trade highlights how deeply intertwined forest resources have been with India's cultural and economic history. Understanding this background helps us see that trade in forest products has been an integral part of India's economic fabric long before colonial times or modern globalization. It also underscores the importance of indigenous communities in sustaining and shaping these trade practices, which connects to our overall theme of how natural resources and local livelihoods are historically linked. When the British arrived in India, they imposed a series of regulations on trade that significantly changed the landscape. They granted trading rights primarily to European trading firms, which often meant that local traders and communities had less control over their traditional ways of commerce. These policies also included restrictions on grazing and hunting by local people, which impacted their livelihoods directly. Many pastoralists and nomadic communities, such as the Kaurava, Karach, and Urukula from the Madras Presidency, faced severe challenges. Their traditional ways of living and earning a livelihood were disrupted, and they were often labeled as criminal tribes. This label was used to control and restrict their movement and activities. Instead of allowing them to continue their pastoral and nomadic lifestyles, the British forced these communities into labor, working in factories, mines, and plantations under government supervision. This shift not only altered their economic lives, but also had long-lasting social impacts. Connecting this to the broader theme of colonial impact, it shows how colonial policies aimed at controlling resources and trade also led to the marginalization of indigenous communities, disrupting their traditional livelihoods and social structures. Now, let's consider whether tribals felt they had work and if they believed they should be happy with it. The reality, however, was quite different. Work for them did not always equate to an improved sense of well-being. In fact, their wages were often very low, and the working conditions were terrible. They faced many challenges, including the difficulty of returning home easily after a day's work. For example, people from Assam, Santals and Oryans from Jharkhand, and Gonds from Chhattisgarh were mostly restricted to working on tea plantations. This highlights how their work was limited and often exploitative, connecting to the larger theme of how marginalized communities were pushed into difficult labor without fair compensation or decent conditions. Let's talk about the rebellion in the forest. When I see this heading, I think about how forest communities, who have traditionally lived in harmony with nature, started to resist the changes imposed on them. These rebellions weren't random. They were driven by real grievances. So, what can be the reasons behind these uprisings? Mainly, they rebelled because they faced suppression, injustice, and atrocities. Their way of life, their culture, and their access to forests were being interfered with, which threatened their very existence. In many parts of India, and even across the world, these communities stood up for their rights. For instance, in Santhal Pargana, which is now part of Jharkhand, leaders like Sidhu and Kanu led the rebellion. They fought because their land, forests, and traditions were being disturbed. Similarly, in the Kingdom of Bastar around 1910, people rebelled due to similar reasons: oppression and interference in their way of life. Moving to the Chotanagpur Plateau, Birsa Munda became a prominent leader, fighting for tribal rights and against colonial and zamindari exploitation. And in Andhra Pradesh, Alluri Sitaram Raju led a famous rebellion as well. What ties all these rebellions together is the common theme. These communities were resisting the encroachments on their forests and their culture. These uprisings reflect their desire to preserve their identity and independence. So, these forest rebellions are a crucial part of our history because they show how indigenous and local communities fought back to protect what was theirs. Let's take a closer look at the geographical structure of Bastar. Geographically, Bastar is situated in the southernmost part of Chhattisgarh, which means it shares borders with 3 states: Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, and Maharashtra. This strategic location influences the region's cultural and economic interactions. The central part of Bastar is characterized by a plateau, which gives the area a distinct elevated terrain. To its north lies the Chhattisgarh Plain, a relatively flat and fertile area that supports agriculture and settlement. Meanwhile, to the south, you'll find the Godavari Plain, which is part of the larger river basin and important for its water resources. Speaking of rivers, the Indravati River flows across Bastar from east to west. This river is vital for the region, not just for water supply, but also for supporting local ecosystems and livelihoods. Overall, the geographical layout of Bastar, with its plateaus, plains, and river systems, has a significant impact on the region's development, culture, and natural resources, tying into our broader discussion of its unique identity within Chhattisgarh. Let's talk about the people of Bastar. Communities like the Maurya and Murya Gons, Darwas, Batras, and Halbas live there. They speak different languages, but what unites them are their shared customs and beliefs. For example, they worship the earth because they believe that their land was given to them by the earth itself. This deep respect is shown through offerings made during each agricultural festival, highlighting their gratitude and connection to nature. They also show respect to the spirits of rivers, forests, and mountains, believing these natural features are alive with spiritual presence. Each village primarily uses natural resources from within its own boundary, which helps sustain their environment. When they need resources from outside their area, they pay a small fee, called devasari, dand, or man, in exchange. This system ensures they maintain a respectful relationship with nature and neighboring communities. To protect their forests, they often employ a watchman. And during annual hunts or gatherings, village headmen from different villages within a larger region, called a paragana, come together. They discuss issues that concern them all, especially matters related to forest conservation and sustainable use. Overall, these practices reflect a profound connection to the land and natural resources, values that are central to their way of life and help sustain their communities over generations. So let's talk about the reasons behind the rebellion in Bastar. In 1905, the colonial government decided to reserve 2/3 of the forest. They also banned shifting cultivation, hunting, and the collection of forest produce. Now, only some villagers were allowed to stay in these reserved forests. You might wonder why only a few were permitted to stay. Well, it was so the forest department could employ people to cut and transport trees and to protect the forest from fires. But this policy caused a lot of problems. Many villagers were displaced without any notice or compensation. Imagine how you would feel if your home or land was taken away suddenly, with no support. On top of that, the local people were already upset because colonial officers increased land rents and demanded free labor and food from them. All these actions made the people of Bastar very worried. They saw these forest policies and the colonial demands as threats to their land, their livelihood, and their way of life, which fueled their desire to resist. So, how did the rebellion actually start? Well, it all began with discussions at public places, where people were protesting against the changes introduced by the colonial government. An important initiative came from the Durvas of Kanjar Forest, who were the first to establish a reservation. This was a significant step because it marked the beginning of organized resistance. The rebellion was led by Gundadhar, a prominent leader from the village of Netahanar. Around 1910, the rebellion took a more tangible form. People started circulating small items like mango boughs, lumps of earth, chilies, and arrows between villages. These items became symbols of the uprising, representing their resistance against the British rule. Every village contributed something to support the rebellion, whether it was resources or effort. Eventually, the rebellion escalated into an outright uprising. There were attacks on British authority, bazaars were looted, houses of officials and traders were robbed, and grains were redistributed among the people. Police stations weren't spared either. They were set on fire, symbolizing a complete rejection of colonial authority. This was a clear sign that the rebellion was gaining momentum and becoming a serious challenge to colonial control. So, what was the response of the British to the rebellion? Well, they didn't take it lightly. They sent troops to suppress the uprising, and their tactics were quite forceful. They surrounded the rebel camps and opened fire, aiming to punish everyone involved. As a result, most villages became deserted as people fled into the jungle to escape the violence. Remarkably, within just 3 months, from February to May, the British managed to regain control over the area. This response highlights how the British maintained their authority and the intense measures they used to crush resistance, which connects to the overall theme of colonial power and control during this period. Was the rebellion a failure? No, I believe it was actually a victory for the rebels. The key reason is that the British did not succeed in capturing Gundadihur, who was the leader of the rebellion. This was a significant point because capturing the leader could have meant the end of the movement. Additionally, the rebellion led to the suspension of the reservation temporarily. This means that the authorities paused their plans for the area, which was a notable outcome. Moreover, the area that was supposed to be reserved was reduced to about half of what was originally planned before 1910. Originally, they intended to reserve 2/3 of the land, but after the rebellion, that was scaled back. So overall, despite any setbacks, the rebels achieved important strategic victories, making this more of a triumph than a defeat. This connects to the larger theme of resistance and resilience in their struggle. After the rebellion, the struggle of the people didn't just end there. The practice of keeping people out of the forests and reserving them for industrial use continued even after independence. So, how did this happen? Well, despite gaining independence, many policies and practices persisted that favored industrial interests over local communities and their rights. In the 1970s, for example, a proposal from the World Bank suggested replacing 4,600 hectares of natural sal forest with tropical pine. The goal was to supply pulp for the paper industry. But local environmentalists strongly protested against this plan, recognizing the importance of preserving the native forests. Their protests were effective, and ultimately, the project was halted. This story of resistance isn't unique to this region. Similar struggles occurred in Indonesia, where local communities and environmental groups also fought against industrial encroachment on their forests. These examples highlight how, despite challenges, local activism can make a real difference in protecting natural resources. Connecting this to our overall theme, it shows that the fight for forest rights and sustainable use has been ongoing. It's a reminder that the resilience of local communities and environmental advocates plays a crucial role in shaping policies and preserving our forests for future generations. Let's take a closer look at the forest transformation in Java. As many of you know, during the colonial period, Java was under Dutch rule, which played a significant role in shaping its landscape. Today, Java is renowned as a major rice-producing island in Indonesia, but it wasn't always this way. In the past, most of Java was covered with dense forests. The Dutch recognized the importance of these forests, especially for timber, which was crucial for shipbuilding at the time. To meet the demand for timber, they initiated forest management practices, which marked a turning point in Java's environmental history. This shift from forested land to managed resources reflects broader themes of colonial influence and economic development. Understanding this transformation helps us see how colonial policies impacted both the environment and local resource use, shaping the landscape we see today. Let's take a closer look at the people of Java, starting with the Kalangs. They were a community of highly skilled woodcutters and shifting cultivators, really vital to the region's development. In fact, their expertise was so valued that during the split of the Mataram Kingdom in 1755, the 6,000 Kalang families were split evenly between the two new kingdoms. This highlights just how important they were, especially in harvesting teak and constructing grand palaces. Moving into the colonial period, the Dutch saw the Kalangs as a useful workforce but also tried to control them. In 1770, the Kalangs resisted this control by attacking a Dutch fort at Jona, showing their resistance and desire for independence. Unfortunately, that uprising was suppressed, but it underscores their resilience and the importance of their skills in the broader history of Java. Connecting this to our overall theme, the Kalangs exemplify how skilled local communities played a crucial role in shaping Java's history, resisting colonial powers, and maintaining their cultural identity despite external pressures. Now, moving on to the Dutch scientific forestry approach in Java, it's important to understand that the Dutch implemented specific forest laws to control how the land was used. These laws restricted local villagers' access to the forests, which was a significant change from traditional practices. Cutting wood was only permitted from designated forests and had to be done under supervision, emphasizing the control and regulation of resource extraction. Additionally, villagers faced penalties if they grazed cattle in young forest stands, transported wood without official permission, or traveled on forest roads with horse carts or cattle. These restrictions reflect the broader theme of how colonial powers managed and often limited local resource use, shaping the landscape and local economies in profound ways. Understanding these policies helps us see the larger picture of colonial forestry practices and their impact on local communities and the environment. Today, I want to tell you about Salmon's challenge, also known as Surrentico salmon. He lived in Randabladung, an area known for its teak forests. Salmon began questioning the idea that the state owned these forests. His main argument was that elements like wind, water, earth, and wood were not created by the government, so logically, they shouldn't be owned by the state either. This idea might seem simple, but it was quite revolutionary at the time. It challenged the traditional authority of the colonial government over natural resources. Soon, his ideas sparked a larger movement, especially through his son-in-law. The Salmonists, as they came to be called, protested in various ways. Some would lie down on their land to prevent the Dutch surveyors from measuring it. Others refused to pay taxes, fines, or do forced labor. By 1907, this movement had grown significantly, with around 3,000 families following Salmon's philosophy. This was a serious challenge to colonial authority and reflects a broader theme in our history: the fight for land rights and resistance against colonial control. It shows how one person's ideas can inspire a widespread movement for justice and independence. Let's take a closer look at how war has historically impacted forests. During the First and Second World Wars, forests around the world experienced significant changes. These conflicts demanded enormous amounts of resources, including wood, which led to widespread deforestation. For example, in India, there was a substantial increase in tree cutting to meet wartime needs, which put additional pressure on already fragile ecosystems. Similarly, in Java, when the Japanese occupied the region during World War II, the Dutch responded with the scorched earth policy. This meant destroying resources, including forests, to prevent their use by the enemy. These examples highlight how wartime strategies and needs have directly contributed to forest loss. It's a stark reminder of how conflict not only affects human populations, but also has devastating effects on our natural environment. This connects to the overall theme of how human activities, especially during times of crisis, can lead to significant environmental changes. Let's talk about the scorched earth policy during this period. Dutch colonial officers took drastic measures by destroying sawmills and burning huge piles of giant teak logs. The goal was to prevent the Japanese from obtaining these valuable resources. At the same time, the Japanese were also exploiting the forests recklessly to support their war industries. This double impact, destruction by the Dutch and exploitation by the Japanese, had serious consequences for the environment. Villagers saw an opportunity in this chaos to expand the cultivable land, which led to significant deforestation. These actions reflect how wartime strategies often involved environmental destruction, which ties into our overall theme of how conflict affects natural resources and local communities. Since the 1980s, we've seen a significant shift across many governments in Asia and Africa. They began to understand that resolving the conflict between scientific forestry and forest conservation was crucial. The focus moved away from just collecting timber to a broader goal of sustainable forest management. So, how can we achieve this? One key idea is involving the people who live near these forests. When local communities are included in conservation efforts, it makes a real difference. For example, in places like Bastar, communities protect sacred groves, which are considered sacred and are preserved by local traditions. Allowing villages to patrol and manage their own forests opens up new ways of thinking about forest management. It encourages a more inclusive, community-driven approach rather than top-down control. Overall, these developments highlight the importance of integrating local people into conservation efforts, which is essential for sustainable and effective forest management. This ties back to our overall theme, that successful conservation depends on collaboration and respecting local knowledge and traditions.